first one we're going to start off with is our finger, and we're going to import it as a footage. So we go imp file, import file, and then we find the image finger. And we're just going to import it as a footage this time instead of a composition, because it's not really a composition. It's not something we created in Photoshop with layers. It's just an image with um, transparent background. So, and again, you don't, if you have an image that you created in Photoshop and you save it as a Photoshop file, for the Puppet Pen tool, as long as it has transparent background, you can import that particular thing as a footage. So we're going to import that as a footage. It's going to say um, it has an alpha channel. What do you want me to do with it? Leave it as straight, because basically that just means that when you open it, it's going to just have black around alpha layer image. And we're going to also open up a new composition, and I'll call this Puppet Pen Practice. We'll call it Puppet Pen Practice Assignment. And we're going to keep it 1280 by 720, 24 frames per second. The duration, I have 1 minute, but just to be sure, I'm just going to make my timeline 2 minutes so that I can, kind of do all of them. And of course, my background is green, so I'm going to just leave it green so that, just so it shows up better on your screen. All right, so once I have my composition, I'm going to drag my footage into my timeline, and I'm just going to start at the beginning of time. So if you remember this, click here, and that marker that's moving as I move the mouse, that's telling me where that clip starts in the timeline. So I want to start it right at the beginning so it fills up the whole thing. Then we have to do some scaling because my image is too big for the screen size. So I'm just going to do something like to scale it down enough so it fits. And then I'm going to insert my Puppet Pen tool. So the way to get to your Puppet Pen tool is this pin right here. It literally looks like a thumbnail on your menu, on your tools menu. And you can, if you click on it, you can and click and hold it down, you'll see the different options. And I'll kind of talk about all of that, but the obvious one is Puppet Position Pin. Um, and so what the Puppet Pin does is wherever you put a pin, that's where it will deform your bitmap image. Well, that's where it's going to deform your pixels. So if I click on the tip of my finger, that's the first pin. I'm going to click here, that's the second pin. I'm going to click somewhere around here, that's the third pin, and click on the wrist, that's the fourth pin. All right. And this is the beauty, well, this is the magic of Puppet Pen. I have the pins now. Watch this. See that? See how it's deforming in relationships in relation to the other pins? And you have total control of these pins, or rather total control to animate them. And basically, again, it's using these pins to set anchors for where they're going to deform. So now that I've screwed up my original, I'm just going to delete it. To delete it, when you insert the Puppet Pin, it shows up in your timeline or the layer that you apply it to under effects. If you've like kind of gone way beyond, if you did something like that and you're like, whoops, I get it back, and you haven't animated and it's not something you really want to deal with fixing, you can just go to the Puppet effect and hit delete on your keyboard and it'll delete it. So the other thing I want to show you is how it really works. When you apply the Puppet Pen, up here you'll see mesh show, and if you click on show mesh, well, if you click on where it says mesh and then show, what the Puppet Pen basically does is it calculates based on the image. So because this is a transparent image, there's no background here. I mean, transparent as in there's no background to this image. It's just looking at that image where the pixels are. And what it's doing is it's applying this mesh, which are basically triangles, and it's calculating the points of the triangle as you move them around. So that's basically what it's doing. If you have a finer mesh, meaning a more detailed thing, um, more detailed image or you need more movements, you can increase the mesh by increasing the density, but don't increase it so much. The default is 10. Don't increase it so much because it requires processing power. So if I increase the density to 20, my mesh becomes more finer, and basically it'll deform a little bit finer. But notice that now it's lagging a little bit. And for the most part, you don't really need something. Density actually only goes well, so you don't really need something that much. I would pop it back to 10. And the expansion is basically how much beyond the edges or the border of your images, the edges that this mesh expands out to. So if I increase the mesh expansion, see how it's expanded? Now it's like really huge because I bumped that number way up high. So that's what it means. It spans. Uh, 0 is ideal for most of your graphics, but sometimes with the number 0, you may have some issues, but not with this, image. So I'm gonna keep the density at 10 and change the expansion to 0 if it's not already 0. And I'm gonna show you what's going on because this is really with the Puppet tool. It's really a case of less is more. If you have too many of these pins, like let's say you're over ambition and you want to do this, thinking that you're going to get the bend here and the bend here. So wherever the puppet pin tools are, that's where it's going to bend. If you do that, just be careful because that means you have to keyframe each one of these as you go along. So that's why I always say less is more with the puppet pin tool. So I'm going to delete it again and just kind of put 2 pins on the tip of the fingers of each of the fingers. Put a pin somewhere around here so that when I bend it, or when you all bend it, the bend is really gonna stop here, even though it's influencing the whole image, because as you see, it's moving around. So I'm gonna put one here as kind of an anchor. So now it's gonna hold that whole entire image unless I move this. But as I bend it, it's going to bend just the fingers. So we only have 4 pins, and that's what I really recommend for this. Again, you can try more, but again, the more you have, the more you have to animate this. So as soon as you put the first pins in, you have to be careful where you are in your timeline. Because if your time marker is further out in your timeline, that's where it's going to put the initial keyframe. And that initial keyframe, because I was at the beginning of my timeline, is here. So in terms of the pin effects, you have Puppet, which basically is like the effect that I was telling you about. The Puppet engine, you have 2 different types. Advanced is better because it takes advantage of newer machines. Mesh rotation refinement, don't worry about that as much right now. Transparent on, transparent off, basically, turning it on and off. Auto trace shape, I honestly don't know what that means. I haven't used it, so I don't know. Probably something to look up later. And don't worry about compositing effects because you're not really compositing anything for this assignment. So let me put the pins again because I deleted it. When you put the pins in, you get something called mesh 1. Now, mesh 1 represents this mesh that you've put over here. You may have a second object, that'll be mesh 2. So, another thing, and then if you have another object, and it'll show up as mesh 2 if you plug it into it. And the mesh is really where all the magic happens, if you will. Under mesh, you have those same options, density and expansion. Now, because you have them, notice that, you can kind of keyframe them, although you can't really keyframe them. This is more or less just allowing you to update this instead of going here. So you can do it all in the timeline instead of going between here and here. So that's number 1. Number 2, deform. When you click on the arrow for deform, it'll reveal the 4 pins that I've placed. Pin number 1, pin number 2, pin number 3, pin number 4. So what I'm going to do is just shift select the pins, expand them, and I just did that because it's better to do that all at once instead of going like this. So you just shift select it and you will be able to expand it. Then what I'm going to do is show you what's going on. So those initial pins that I put down, and it matters because it's going to put those initial pins, keyframes, pins, wherever your play marker is, or your time marker, time indicator. Um, so it was in the beginning of my timeline, that's why I put it here. Now, if you wanted to start later, but you've already put your puppet pins down already at an earlier time, you can simply, just like any other keyframe, you can grab them all and move them around. So I'm going to move this to 15, not 15 seconds, but 15 frames. Zoom in on my timeline a little bit. So I'm going to go to 15 frames, well, actually 12 frames. And this is where our animation will start. So this keyframe indicates, again, just like anything else in After Effects, this keyframe indicates that at 12 frames, this is the position where the puppet pins are. You also have other options too, but I'm just going to go over a position for the purposes of our class. So in order to animate it, all you got to do is just go just like everything else. Let me zoom in a bit more. You go a few frames down on my timeline, move my time indicator a few frames, and start moving my hands, my fingers, I should say. And we're just gonna do this and continue doing this. Now, if you watch your own hand as you cross your finger, um, you know, it does things differently. So, I mean, not differently, but you'll see the details of it. So notice that my pin 3, pin 4, and pin 3, this pin and this pin, because I didn't move it, there's no keyframe. But I just want to insert the keyframes so that, um, or make just some subtle movement so that it doesn't look so static. Static meaning boring and like it's not really moving. Um, you want to have, even if your pins aren't moving, you want to have keyframes anyway, just because you need them to kind of hold them in place. So my final animation is this. And again, it could be better. I could maybe insert another pin here and here. Now I got more pins to animate, which is, I mean, if you're okay with that, that's fine. The other thing is be careful. Sometimes you're moving two and you don't want to move two. And again, like I said, more pins will usually give you better results, but at the cost of having to do more animation. And sometimes you can really mess it up. If you don't like that mesh showing, you can just uncheck this. This is kind of odd where the thumb is like um, stuck in that finger. So that's another, those things are stuff that you need to watch out for. They can kind of get you in trouble because you're having to deal with all these other things, and sometimes you don't get that realistic, or that illusion becomes more of like, instead of doing like crossing their fingers, you end up like breaking their fingers. So be careful of how you end up processing it. But basically, this is the first one. Okay, so that's the first portion of what you need to do. And once you're done with that, you can hold it there So let's say you wanted to cross its finger for like a couple of seconds, and then shift select all of the pins and put your keyframe here so that when you're ready to begin having the finger go back to the original position, you can it starts from here, so it'll hold from this keyframe to here since those keyframes are the same. And then we're going to go a few frames and I'm just going to do this real quickly with one move instead of like all these keyframes here that I did in the beginning. And you can kind of go back to the original shape. You can do it like me, or you can do it a little bit smarter, like copy that first frame, paste it there. As long as I got my time marker over here, remember if you copy, Control C and then Control V. So I'm copying that first keyframe and pasting it for all of the puppet pins. Oh, for all of the puppet pins. All right, so so we go there, do this intricate movement, holds from this point in time to this point, and then in half a second it goes to the original. So that's the introduction of using Puppet Pin Tool in After Effects.